Welcome. For this presentation, we will be looking at two military historical sources, that of Publius Cornelius Tacitus, known simply as Tacitus, and Lucius Cassius Dio, also known as Cassius Dio or just Dio. We will analyze their reliability as sources through a common event that both men wrote about, that of the Iceni revolt against the Roman Empire in 60 AD. Though neither man experienced a revolt firsthand, they are the primary historical sources for the events that transpired. However, there are some glaring inconsistencies between them. In order to critique their account of the incident, we have to look at the men themselves, the world they inhabited, and the common attitudes and biases of the time. By cross-referencing their accounts of the Iceni revolt, we might be in a better position to sift fact from fiction. Tacitus was a Roman orator and one of its greatest historians. Unfortunately, the details of his life are scarce, and the majority of his work has been lost. We do know that he was born into a wealthy family of equestrian status around 56 AD, during the Pax Romana and the reign of the infamous Nero. It is not known for certain where his home was, but he probably came from the towns of Gallia Narbonensis. His father had been an imperial official, holding the important post of procurator, allowing for excellent education for his son. As a young man, he married the only daughter of Gnaeus Julius Agricola, a soldier and administrator, and Tacitus' main source of information regarding the Iceni revolt. Tacitus went on to have a successful political career before turning his focus to recording history and the literary arts. His two most important surviving works are the Annals and the Histories. Cassius Dio was born around 100 years after Tacitus, during the peaceful reign of Antonius Pius. The son of a Roman senator, Dio called the Roman province of Bithynia his home. Like Tacitus, he also engaged upon a political trajectory, rising through the ranks from senator to praetor to regional governor. However, he is most well known for his literary works, which chronicled the history of Rome up until his own time. Of his 80 books, 19 still exist in full. When it comes to the record of the Iceni uprising, both Tacitus and Dio would have access to different resources. Tacitus could rely upon his father-in-law, Gnaeus Julius Agricola, who had served the Roman general Gaius Suetonius Paulinus in suppressing the Iceni, and therefore had first-hand accounting. Dio, on the other hand, would most likely be relying upon Tacitus' documentation, and whatever might have been available at the time that has been lost to history, alongside, perhaps, his own imagination. The uprising of Iceni was an attempt by the local Celtic tribes to overthrow the occupying forces of the Roman Empire in 60 or 61 AD. The revolt was led by the Iceni queen, Boudica, also called Boadicea. Both Tacitus and Dio offer up different explanations as to what prompted the revolt. According to Tacitus, the Iceni king Prasutagus had recently died and had named the Emperor Nero his heir along with his two daughters, an act of deference which he thought would place his kingdom and household beyond the risk of injury. This had the opposite effect. The Iceni kingdom was pillaged and the people mistreated. Boudica was lashed and her daughters raped. This incited the Iceni and other nearby tribes to rally behind Boudica in revenge against the Romans. Cassius Dio, however, offers a completely different reason for the rebellion, claiming, quote, "An excuse for the war was found in the confiscation of the sums of money that Claudius had given to the foremost Britons. For these sums, as the Canis Catus, the procurator of the island, maintained, were to be paid back. This was one reason for the uprising. Another was found in the fact that Seneca, in the hope of receiving a good rate of interest, had lent to the islanders 40 million sesterces that they did not want, and had afterwards called in this loan all at once, and had resorted to severe measures in exacting it." In fact, Cassius Dio makes no mention of Boudica being assaulted or her daughters violated. At first, these seem like contradictory reasons. However, they are not mutually exclusive. While Tacitus does not mention finances as a possible reason for the uprising, this could simply be oversight on his part. Later on in the Annals, he does mention Procurator Catus's greed. It is quite possible that both factors contributed to the need of the Iceni to seek revenge. However, the fact that Cassius Dio does not even mention the assault on Boudica or mistreatment of her people is somewhat troubling, as he would have access to Tacitus' records as a source. It is possible that this omission was used to promulgate a more positive image of the Romans in regards to the whole affair, and delegitimize the Iceni as an aggrieved party. And here we can begin to see the contrast between the two historians. Whereas Tacitus seems to prefer concise, factual retelling, Cassius Dio seems to have no compunctions about embellishment. We can see that in his description of Boudica herself. Whereas Tacitus provides no physical description of her, Cassius Dio goes into great detail, stating, quote, "In stature she was very tall, in appearance most terrifying, and the glance of her eyes most fierce, and her voice was harsh. A great mass of the tawniest hair fell to her hips. Around her neck was a large golden necklace, and she wore a tunic of diverse colors over which a thick mantle was fastened with a brooch. This was her invariable attire." While this description was not necessarily conjured up by Dio, there is no corresponding historical documents to back it, though it is quite possible that Dio had access to personal records that has since been destroyed. However, Dio then goes on to detail a lengthy speech given by Boudica in order to rally her forces. As the Celts had no writing system to transcribe that speech, this detail is most assuredly added by Dio himself for dramatic effect. After Boudica had rallied her forces, they marched upon the three main Roman settlements in Britain, burning them to the ground and killing all their inhabitants. Again, we see a discrepancy in the two accounts. Cassius Dio only mentions 2 cities, and those not by name. However, he does go on at great length as to the fate that many of the inhabitants suffered at the hands of the Britons. Tacitus, on the other hand, names all 3 cities by name, that of Camulodunum, Londinium, and Verulamium, but passes over quickly as to the fate of those captured by the Celtic forces. Again, this appears to be more dramatization by Dio, as is accounting of the size of the Iceni forces, which he reckons arbitrarily at around 230,000 men, whereas Tacitus does not hazard a guess, simply calling the Iceni numbers unprecedented. At this point, Gaius Suetonius, the Roman general in the area, having abandoned Londinium as indefensible, now marched up what would later be called Watling Street, in search of a more preferable battleground. Tacitus claims that Suetonius deliberately chose the spot upon which to make his stand, whereas Dio claims he was forced to engage the Celts out of desperation. In either event, Suetonius placed his troops in a defile, with strong woods to his back and to his flanks, so that Boudica could not bring her superior numbers to bear all at once. At this point, Tacitus claims that both Suetonius and Boudica gave inspiring speeches to their forces before battle. Boudica's speech comes off more as a reaffirmation of the grievances they have against the Romans, and is likely to be what Tacitus imagined her speech to be. Suetonius' speech, on the other hand, is blunt and practical, deriding the Celts as barbarians, their numbers full of women, and handing out tactical advice on how to win. As Tacitus' father-in-law was part of Suetonius' staff, this speech is more than likely close to the actual words that were said. Dio's account, however, affords the Celts no such speeches. Instead, he focused on General Suetonius, going from unit to unit, offering inspirational words. The speech is done with, the Celtic forces charged the Roman legions. While Dio's account of the battle is more romanticized, both historians agree on the basics. The Celts were lightly armed and lightly armored, charging head-on into Roman legions. Those legions responded by throwing their pila, and then maneuvering into wedge formations. The Celts had no other strategies to offer beyond the head-on assault. The Romans, on the other hand, were a well-oiled, steel-clad machine, and proceeded to chew through the numerically superior Celtic forces. Near the end, the Celtic warriors were pushed back into their own wagon train, where their families waited. The Romans showed no mercy to men or women, and just like that, the uprising of the Iceni was over. There is, of course, one more discrepancy. Tacitus claims that Boudica took her own life with poison, whereas Dio claims that she simply fell sick and died. The truth can be either, or neither, and was in fact probably unknown to both men. In Tacitus' case, this might have been an invention of his own, as poisoning oneself was a fairly common practice in Roman society in order to avoid undue suffering or humiliation. On Dio's side, he may not have wanted to give Boudica a martyr's death, and simply had her die off in a mundane way. Looking back, we can conjecture about a couple of the contradictions between Tacitus and Dio, such as a reason for the revolt. It could have been either Dio or Tacitus' factor, or both. Another factor that might have motivated the Romans to deal with the Iceni in the way that they did was who Prasutagus made co-heirs of his kingdom, his daughters. While the Celts were a fairly egalitarian society, the Romans viewed women as lesser and allowed them no political power. We can see that in the derogatory way that both Tacitus and Dio write about Boudica, claiming that it was the greatest of shames to be beaten by a woman. Dio's description of Boudica could have been a deliberate insult, to make her appear as unattractive to Roman eyes as possible, since her characterization would have gone against the Roman ideal. It is quite possible that upon Prasutagus' death, the procurator Catus saw no reason for Rome to share the Iceni kingdom with two young females, and simply moved in to reduce them to a client state, humiliating them in the process. In analyzing this chapter of history, we must be cognizant of who was writing it. Both Tacitus and Dio were proud Roman citizens of considerable standing, who both lived near the height of the Roman Empire. Their narratives are both skewed towards a pro-Roman stance, though Tacitus seems more inclined to record history as he has heard it, with more emphasis on the details, whereas Dio appears to unashamedly spin the tale of the uprising into a near-Roman myth, with unnecessary additions of grand speeches he could not possibly know, and dramatic events taking precedence over hard fact. He skips over the names of the destroyed Roman cities in Britain to focus on the suffering of its inhabitants, in order to evoke an emotional response towards the Romans. Where Tacitus would not hazard a guess as to the size of the Celtic army, Dio simply conjures up a large number, 230,000, which modern-day historians consider exaggerated. This seems done solely for dramatic effect and to extol the virtues of the Roman military. In conclusion, when looking at ancient historical sources, such as Tacitus and Cassius Dio, it is vital to remember the historical context in which they lived instead of layering our own modern sensibilities on what we read. Both Tacitus, and especially Dio, would have had little issue with recording history with a Roman bias, as opposed to the more objective stance we expect from historians today. Despite their bias, their records are invaluable, as without them, this small chapter in human history would be lost to time. We are also lucky that we have both accounts to compare and contrast, as they give us the lines to read between, as that is where the truth tends to live. Thank you for your time, and I hope you have enjoyed this presentation.